Good evening. So, in today's discussion board, I'm continuing my discussion of the women's suffrage movement. This week, my sources come from the America History and Life collection from Liberty University. I found three sources this week that go along with my continuing research on the women's suffrage movement and the tactics of the movement. So the first source that I found is called Placards at the White House, and it's by Jean H. Baker. The second source that I found is called Out of the Parlors and Into the Streets, the Changing Tactical Repertoire of the U.S. Women's Suffrage Movement, and that one is by Holly J. McCammon. She is actually someone who I have read before and utilized before in the past. And the last article that I found is called Never a Fight of Woman Against Man, What Textbooks Don't Say About Women's Suffrage. And this one is by Joe C. Miller. In this first article by Jean Baker, she discusses the decision by Alice Paul to have the women of the National Women's Party, or the NWP, to picket the White House. Baker says that despite this being a militant and radical step by the women, Alice Paul believed that it was a step that was necessary for President Wilson, in order to get President Wilson to endorse a change in the U.S. Constitution. They began their picketing on January 11th, 1917, and by 6 months later, the conflict between the picketers and the president had escalated pretty quickly, and the women were actually arrested. While in jail, Paul and the other women went on a hunger strike, and it got the attention of the news. By 1918, President Wilson was asking the Senate for support of the suffrage amendment. Baker states that the morning in January 1917, when Alice Paul and members of the NWP began picketing the White House, they took a critical step towards equality for women. Now, the second article I looked at was by Holly J. McCammon, and it discusses the circumstances that led individual state suffrage movements to use the new tactic of the suffrage parade. Now, for that period, the suffrage parade, like picketing, was a rather radical step. McCammon uses an event history analysis to reveal that organizational readiness and political opportunities had little to do with change in the suffragist strategic approach. McCammon states that political influence that states that political defeats influence the time when a movement will turn to a new form of collective action, and that when confronted with a significant defeat, movement actors are forced to reconsider whether they are indeed using effective tactics. She also argues that the characteristics of the movement itself are important in producing shifts in strategic action. Now, in her conclusion, she asks what I think is a really important question about the conclusion of her research. And when she states, can these impetuses for change that have been determined by the research predict, for instance, when a movement will turn to acts of sabotage, violence, or even terrorism, where perhaps only a few movement members participate in covert action? Now, I think only time and, of course, more research will tell or will answer this particular question. Now, the final article I looked at is by Joe C. Miller, and in this article, Miller discusses how the women's suffrage movement was never a fight of woman against man, which is a typical thought process when people think about the women's suffrage movement. They look at it as sort of this man versus woman idea. Now, in a quote by suffrage leader Alice Stone Blackwell in 1914, she says, "It was always about the struggle of broad-minded men and women on one side against narrow-minded men and women on the other. It wasn't the struggle of one gender against another, but against those who were resistant to change." Miller looks at two things in his article. One, why intelligent, progressive, capable women led organized opposition against the women's suffrage movement. So there was this whole entire group of women who were actually opposed to suffrage. What was their reasoning and other questions like that? And two, he looks at the origin of the whole woman or women versus men view of the suffrage struggle and suggests some changes in how this area of history could be better taught. Now, I think overall this article is actually more pertinent to teaching the women's suffrage movement and explaining the opposition to the suffrage movement. Now, I typically don't look at the opposition to the movement as much, but I enjoyed his really informative discussion and the inclusion of information from primary sources. And I think that when I do actually write my dissertation, I will probably actually go into some of the opposition because I think it's an important subject. I've used, Jean Baker and Holly McCammon before when I was working on research on women's suffrage movement. They're both very prolific authors on the subject, but this is the first time I'd actually come across Joe Miller or Joe C. Miller. But I like his style, so I will probably use him in the future. So thank you for listening and have a good evening.